Admiral Boram stood at the large window of her command ship, watching something that should have been terrifying, but somehow wasn't. 12 small human ships were flying straight toward the biggest space armada anyone had ever seen. 3,000 alien warships stretched across the darkness like a deadly metal forest, each one capable of destroying entire planets. Commander Kaiven of the Empire's main battleship called Dark Conquest was having the time of his life. His bug-like face twisted into what passed for a grin among his species, and the strange clicking sounds coming from his mouth meant he was laughing hard. "Look at these stupid humans," he said to his crew, pointing at the approaching ships. 12 tiny boats against our 3,000 war machines. Do they think this is some kind of joke? His voice had that grinding, metallic sound that his species made when they found something really funny. The human ships did look pretty sad compared to the alien fleet. They were made of regular steel, welded together like someone had built them in their backyard garage. The aliens had energy weapons that could melt through mountains, shields that could stop nuclear bombs, and computers that could think faster than 1,000 human brains put together. The human ships barely showed up on their sensors. They were so weak that the alien computers almost ignored them completely. But then Admiral Boram's voice came through the radio, and she sounded way too calm for someone about to die. "This is Admiral Boram of the human fleet," she said, like she was ordering coffee instead of facing certain death. "We're giving you one chance to turn around and leave our space. You've made a really big mistake coming here." Commander Kaiven's laughter got even louder. The sound echoed through his ship like metal grinding against metal. His crew joined in, making their own horrible clicking and buzzing sounds. To them, this was the funniest thing they'd heard in years. "A mistake," Kaiven managed to say between laughs. "The only mistake here is that your species ever thought they could survive in this galaxy. Show us this big mistake we made, little human, before we turn your entire planet into space dust." The battle started exactly like everyone expected it would. The alien ships opened fire, and the space around Earth lit up like the biggest fireworks show ever created. Plasma beams that burned hotter than the center of a star slammed into the human ships. The humans fired back with their primitive weapons, but it was like throwing rocks at a tank. One by one, the human ships exploded in brilliant balls of fire and metal. Their shields, which were barely worthy of the name, collapsed after just a few seconds of alien fire. The humans tried to fight back, tried to run, tried to do anything that might help them survive. But it was hopeless. They were like ants trying to fight eagles. Commander Kaiven watched with satisfaction as each human ship died. His tactical officer called out the kills like he was keeping score in a game. Target 7 destroyed. Target 8 breaking apart. Target 9's engines are gone. Within 4 minutes it was over. 11 human ships had been completely destroyed, turned into nothing but glowing debris floating in space. The 12th ship, Admiral Boram's flagship, was still there but barely. It was spinning slowly, powerless, with fires burning along its hull. Black smoke poured from holes in its side. "Pathetic," Kaiven said, shaking his head. "I've seen training. Exercises that lasted longer than this. Prepare my victory message to the Galactic Council. Tell them that Earth is ready for harvesting, and that human resistance has been completely eliminated." His communications officer started working on the message that would seal Earth's fate. Soon the Empire's colony ships would arrive to strip the planet of everything valuable and turn any surviving humans into slaves. But then something unexpected happened. The main screen on Kaiven's bridge flickered to life, and Admiral Boram's face appeared. She should have been dead, or at least terrified and begging for mercy. Instead, she was sitting calmly in what looked like the bridge of her burning ship, and she was smiling. Not just smiling, she looked genuinely happy, like someone had just told her good news. "Commander Kaiven," she said in that same calm voice, "thank you for that excellent demonstration. Now that you've shown us exactly what your weapons can do and how your ships fight, I think it's only fair that we show you what we can do in return." Kaiven stared at the screen, his amusement turning into confusion. Behind Boram he could see her ship's bridge sparking and smoking. Alarms were going off, and her crew was working frantically to keep their ship from exploding completely. "You're Fleet is completely destroyed, he said slowly, like he was talking to a child. Your ship is about to blow up. Your planet has no defenses left. What could you possibly do now? Boram's smile got even wider, and for the first time Khyven felt a tiny cold spot in his stomach. "Oh, Commander," she said, and her voice had changed somehow. It still sounded calm, but now there was something else underneath it. Something that made the hair on the back of Khyven's neck stand up, even though he didn't have hair. "That wasn't our real fleet," Boram said, and now she was grinning like someone who'd just played the perfect trick. "Those 12 ships, they were just what we wanted you to see, just a little test to find out exactly how strong you really are." Khyven felt his blood turn cold. "What do you mean?" "We needed to know how your weapons work, how fast your ships are, how you fight and how you think," Boram continued. "And now we do, so thank you for the free lesson, Commander. Now class is over, and it's time for the real test to begin." The space around Earth started doing something that shouldn't have been possible. It began to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement, except this was happening in the cold vacuum of space, where nothing should shimmer at all. Commander Khyven watched through his viewport as reality itself seemed to bend and twist. Then, the impossible became terrifying. Ships began appearing out of nowhere. Not just a few ships, but thousands upon thousands of them. They didn't jump out of hyperspace or decloak from hiding. They simply materialized as if they had always been there, and everyone had just forgotten to notice them. These weren't like any ships Khyven had ever seen in his long military career. The human ships that had just been destroyed looked like primitive garbage compared to these new vessels. These ships were sleek and beautiful, with curves that seemed to flow like water frozen in time. But the strangest thing was how they seemed to bend light around themselves. Sometimes you could see them clearly, and sometimes they seemed to fade into the background like they were made of liquid starlight. Khyven's tactical officer was frantically working at his console, and the panic in his voice was clear. "Sir, the energy readings from these ships are off every scale we have. Our computers can't even process what they're seeing. It's like trying to measure the ocean with a teaspoon." Admiral Boram was still on the main screen, still sitting calmly in her burning ship, and she started talking like she was having a casual conversation with an old friend. "You know, Commander, this whole thing started about 300 years ago," she said, settling back in her damaged chair like she had all the time in the world. "Humans were just starting to explore beyond our solar system when we met some beings who called themselves the Architects." As she spoke, Khyven realized that his ship's computers were going crazy. Warning lights were flashing everywhere, and his crew was shouting reports that didn't make any sense. Systems that had worked perfectly for decades were suddenly acting like they had minds of their own. These architects had been watching civilizations across the galaxy for a very long time, Boram continued. They'd seen species rise and fall, build great things and destroy beautiful things. They'd watched the same patterns repeat over and over again, and they were getting pretty tired of it. Boram paused and looked directly at Khyven through the screen. Even though she was millions of miles away on a dying ship, it felt like she was looking right into his soul. "They were especially disappointed with empires like yours, Commander. All this advanced technology, all this power. And what do you do with it? You use it to wipe out entire species just because you can." The architects found that behavior very disappointing. Suddenly a voice filled Khyven's ship, but it wasn't coming through the communication systems. It was coming from everywhere at once, like the voice was speaking directly into everyone's mind. The voice was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like listening to music played on instruments that had been made from captured lightning and crystallized time. "Galactic Empire vessel. Dark conquest," the voice said, and each word seemed to carry the weight of entire galaxies. "Your actions against developing species violate cosmic ethical parameters. Evaluation of your civilization is now complete." Khyven felt his blood turn to ice water. "What evaluation? What are you talking about?" Boram smiled, and for the first time, Khyven noticed that her eyes had changed. They looked deeper somehow, like looking into the night sky and seeing not just stars but the vast spaces between them. The architects have been testing your empire for a while now, Commander. Every time you destroyed a peaceful planet, every time you enslaved a species that couldn't fight back, every time you chose violence over diplomacy, they were watching and taking notes. The voice spoke again, and this time Khyven could feel it in his bones. Your species possesses great potential but has chosen the path of destruction. Corrective measures will now be implemented. The thing about humans, Boram said, and now her voice carried some of that same otherworldly quality, is that we're really good at learning new things. When the architects showed us their technology, we didn't try to steal it or weaponize it. We asked them to teach us. And they were happy to do it. Khyven watched in growing horror as his ship's weapon systems started changing. The displays showed his plasma cannons transforming into something else entirely. His tactical officer was shouting reports that sounded like they came from a fever dream. "Sir, our main weapons are changing into... I don't know how to describe this. They look like plants now, flowering plants." "The architects taught us some fascinating things," Boram continued, as if she was discussing the weather instead of the complete transformation of known physics. How to fold space and time, how to manipulate matter at the quantum level, how to integrate consciousness with technology. We turned out to be excellent students. All around the Dark Conquest, the same thing was happening to every ship in the Galactic Fleet. Weapons were transforming into gardens. Armor plating was becoming something that looked like crystallized music. The most feared military force in the galaxy was turning into the most beautiful art installation anyone had ever seen. "How you see, Commander," Boram said, and now her smile was gentle instead of scary. "The architects don't believe in destroying civilizations. They believe in helping them grow into something better. Your empire is about to experience some changes." Khyven tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. "What kind of changes?" "Your species is going to discover that conquest isn't as satisfying as you thought it was," Boram explained. "You're going to find yourselves much more interested in art, philosophy, and building things instead of destroying them. You're going to learn what it feels like to care about other beings instead of just using them." The voice spoke one more time, and now it sounded almost kind. "Species of the Galactic Empire, your emotional growth phase will now begin. Do not be afraid. This is not punishment. This is graduation." Khyven looked around his bridge and saw his crew staring at their transformed weapons with wonder instead of fear. One of his officers had picked up what used to be a plasma rifle and was now a beautiful flowering vine, and instead of being horrified, the officer was smiling. "This is impossible," Khyven whispered. "No, Commander," Boram said softly. "This is what's possible when you choose to grow instead of destroy. Welcome to the next phase of your civilization's development." One moment Admiral Boram was on her burning ship millions of miles away, and the next moment she was standing right there on the bridge of the Dark Conquest. She didn't beam in like in science fiction movies, didn't walk through a doorway, didn't even seem to move at all. She was just suddenly there. Like reality had decided she had always belonged in that exact spot. Commander Khyven jumped back in shock, and his security team immediately raised their weapons. But as they pulled the triggers, something wonderful and impossible happened. Their deadly plasma rifles started changing in their hands. The metal began to shift and flow like liquid, sprouting green stems and colorful petals. Within seconds, the most elite soldiers in the galaxy were holding chains of daisies instead of weapons designed to kill. One of the guards looked down at his flower chain with complete confusion. "Sir, my weapon has become... Is this a daisy?" "Don't worry about the flowers," Boram said cheerfully, walking over to what looked like an empty spot and sitting down in a chair that definitely hadn't been there a moment before. "They're only temporary. Your weapons will change back to normal once you stop thinking violent thoughts. Though I have to warn you, that might take quite a while." She settled into the impossible chair like she owned the place, completely relaxed. Despite being surrounded by confused and increasingly panicked alien soldiers, through the massive viewport that showed the space around them, the most incredible transformation anyone had ever witnessed was taking place. The Galactic Empire's armada, which just minutes before had been the most feared military force in known space, was turning into something that looked like it belonged in a dream. Warships that had destroyed entire planets were sprouting gardens along their hulls. Massive weapon platforms designed to crack moons in half were reshaping themselves into beautiful art installations that sparkled with their own inner light. The massive dreadnought called Death's Promise, which had been named for the terror it brought to its enemies, now had a giant holographic sign floating above it that read, "Free Hugs," in letters that could be seen from several star systems away. "You know what's funny about meeting beings with technology far beyond your own?" Boram asked, accepting a cup of steaming tea that had appeared from thin air. She took a sip and smiled appreciatively. Most species immediately try to figure out how to steal it or turn it into a weapon. They see something amazing and their first thought is, how can I use this to hurt my enemies? She looked around at Khyven's crew, who were all staring at her with the kind of expression people get when their entire understanding of reality has just been turned upside down. But humans, when we met the architects and saw their incredible abilities, you know what we did? We invited them over for dinner. We asked them about their favorite books. We wanted to know what kind of music they liked and whether they had any good stories to share. Khyven's communication officer, who had been trying to contact other ships in the fleet, suddenly started shouting reports that sounded like they came from some kind of alternate universe. "Commander, I'm getting reports from across the entire Empire. Our attack fleets have stopped their assault missions and are now hosting poetry reading sessions. The interrogation centers on Prison World 7 have all been converted into meditation halls. Our weapon manufacturing plants are no longer producing plasma cannons. They're making violins and flutes and other musical instruments." "Ah," Boram nodded knowingly. "The empathy wave has reached the outer territories, right on schedule." "The what wave?" Khyven demanded, though his voice sounded different somehow. Less harsh, less commanding. "The empathy wave," Boram explained patiently. "You see, the architects discovered something interesting about your species and most of the other aggressive civilizations in the galaxy. You're not naturally violent or cruel. Those behaviors were learned, programmed into you over centuries of military conditioning and fear-based thinking." She gestured toward the transformed fleet outside. "What they did was activate neural pathways in your brains that have been dormant for generations, pathways connected to empathy, creativity, compassion, and wonder. You're about to start experiencing emotions that your species has been suppressing for so long that you'd forgotten they existed." Commander Khyven felt something very strange happening inside his mind. Thoughts that had seemed perfectly normal just minutes ago now felt foreign and uncomfortable. The idea of conquering other worlds, of enslaving weaker species, of destroying anything that stood in the Empire's way, all of these concepts that had driven his entire life suddenly seemed hollow and pointless. For the first time in his adult life, he found himself wondering what it would be like to create something instead of destroying it. What would it feel like to help someone instead of hurting them? What was the point of having power if you only used it to make others afraid? "What have you done to us?" he whispered, and there was genuine fear in his voice. But it wasn't fear of death or defeat. It was the fear of someone who was realizing that everything they thought they knew about themselves might be wrong. "You've made us human," he said, the words coming out like an accusation. Boram's smile was gentle and understanding. "No, Commander, we haven't made you human. We've made you yourselves, the real version of your species that existed before centuries of fear and aggression corrupted your natural nature." She stood up from her impossible chair and walked over to the viewport, looking out at the transformed fleet with obvious satisfaction. "Every species in the galaxy has the capacity for both creation and destruction, for both love and hate. The architects have simply helped your people remember which path leads to actual happiness and fulfillment." One of Khyven's officers, still holding his chain of daisies, spoke up in a voice full of wonder. "Sir, I'm getting a strange urge to ask the humans if they need any help with anything. Is that normal?" "Perfectly normal," Boram assured him. "That's what caring about other people feels like. It might be a new sensation for you, but I promise it gets easier with practice." Across the galaxy, something unprecedented was happening to the most feared military leaders in known space. Supreme Overlord Thargon, who had been called the Terror of 14 Systems and whose very name made entire planets surrender without a fight, had locked himself in his private chambers 3 days ago and refused to come out. His personal guards could hear strange sounds coming from inside, sounds that definitely weren't the usual angry roaring or strategic planning sessions. They were softer sounds, almost like crying. When they finally worked up the courage to peek through the security cameras, they couldn't believe what they saw. The most ruthless military commander in galactic history was sitting on his throne, surrounded by empty food containers, watching human romantic comedies on a massive screen, and he was sobbing uncontrollably. Not the angry, frustrated sobbing of a defeated warrior, but the kind of gentle, cathartic crying that comes when someone finally allows themselves to feel emotions they've been holding back for decades. Why didn't they tell each other how they felt sooner? Thargon wailed at the screen, clutching a box of tissues. All that pain could have been avoided if they'd just been honest about their feelings. Meanwhile, his war council had completely abandoned their invasion plans for the Outer Rim territories. Instead, they'd arranged their chairs in a circle and were holding group therapy sessions led by some of the political prisoners they'd been planning to execute the week before. "I think my aggression comes from a deep fear of not being valued," General Vextar was saying, while his former enemies nodded sympathetically and offered emotional support. Back aboard the Dark Conquest, Admiral Boram was getting regular updates on the transformation happening across the Empire. She sat comfortably in her impossible chair, reviewing reports that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. "Status report," she requested, though she already knew the news would be good. Commander Kyvan, who was sitting nearby at a small pottery wheel that had somehow appeared on his military bridge, looked up from the clay bowl he was shaping with his hands. The sight of the galaxy's former terror methodically working clay between his fingers while humming a gentle tune was something that would have been impossible to imagine a week ago. "The changes are spreading faster than we anticipated," he said, carefully smoothing the rim of his bowl. "It's like watching flowers bloom across an entire garden at once." Communications Officer Da-Un, who had been monitoring channels across the galaxy, delivered her report with barely contained amazement. "Admiral, the Vegan Confederacy has officially declared themselves conscientious objectors and are refusing to participate in any more military actions. The mechanized horde sent formal apologies to all their former enemies, along with gift baskets full of fresh fruit and handwritten poetry." She paused to check her screens again, shaking her head in wonder. "The Ruthless Armada has renamed themselves the Thoughtful Armada, and they're offering free psychological counseling to all the species they've attacked over the past century." "The architect's work is very thorough," Boram noted with obvious approval. "Any species capable of organizing themselves across an entire galaxy has the emotional capacity for galactic-level empathy and compassion. They just needed someone to help them remember how to access those feelings." Commander Kyvan paused. In his pottery work, his mandibles somehow managing to convey a sense of deep vulnerability that would have been impossible for his species just days earlier. "Admiral, I need to ask you something that's been bothering me. If the architects have had this power all along, why didn't they intervene sooner? Why didn't they stop the Cetacean Wars or prevent the Crystal Hive from consuming the Artistic Republic?" Boram considered the question carefully. "It's all about timing, Commander. The galaxy needed to reach a certain level of technological and social development before this kind of intervention would create lasting change. If the architects had tried this too early, the old patterns of fear and aggression would have returned within a generation or two." She gestured toward the viewport, where they could see former warships working together to construct something beautiful and impossible. "But now you have the tools and the wisdom to build something better, something that will last." Outside, the transformation of the galactic fleet was creating wonders that no one had ever imagined. Former dreadnoughts were collaborating to build massive space gardens filled with plants from 1,000 different worlds. Weapon platforms had been converted into recreational facilities where different species could meet and share their cultures. Educational centers were springing up everywhere, staffed by former soldiers who were discovering they had talents for teaching and nurturing they never knew existed. The ship that had once been called Death's Promise had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. It was now a floating library the size of a small moon, hosting interspecies poetry competitions and cultural exchange programs. Former enemies were working side by side, sharing stories and learning about each other's histories and dreams. The architects aren't conquerors, Boram continued, watching the peaceful construction work with satisfaction. They're more like gardeners. They plant seeds of possibility and then wait patiently for civilizations to grow into their better selves. Humans just happen to be ready for that kind of growth first. Commander Kaivan held up his pottery bowl, examining it from different angles. It was lumpy and imperfect, clearly the work of a beginner. It had no military purpose, no strategic value, no practical application in warfare or conquest. By every measure he'd used to judge worth for his entire life, it was completely useless. "I created this," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "With my own hands, I made something that didn't exist before. Something that serves no purpose except to exist and maybe hold water or food for someone who needs it." He looked at Boram with eyes that seemed to see the world differently than they had before. "And I love it. I love this simple, imperfect thing I made. I love the feeling of creating instead of destroying. I love knowing that I can build something beautiful instead of tearing down what others have built." Boram smiled, remembering her own first pottery attempts back when humans were still learning from the architects. "That feeling you're experiencing, Commander, that joy in creation, that satisfaction in building something with your own hands, that's what the architects want every species in the galaxy to discover. Not the empty pleasure of domination, but the deep fulfillment of contributing something positive to the universe." 6 months had passed since what historians were already calling the Great Empathy Event, and the changes across the galaxy were so dramatic that many people wondered if they were living in some kind of beautiful dream. The former Galactic Empire, which had once struck terror into the hearts of billions, was holding its very first democratic feelings assembly aboard a ship that used to be a weapon of mass destruction. The massive vessel had been renamed the Emotional Support, and it was barely recognizable as the same ship that had once carried planet-killing weapons. The hull was now covered in gardens from 1,000 different worlds, and the interior had been completely redesigned as a welcoming space where beings could gather to share ideas and emotions instead of planning conquests. Representatives from 1,200 different species had come together for this historic meeting. Instead of the usual military uniforms and intimidating armor, everyone wore clothing that reflected their personal style and cultural heritage. The atmosphere was more like a festival than a government assembly, with beings sharing poetry, engaging in philosophical discussions, and working together to organize what they were calling the galaxy's largest group hug. Admiral Boram sat in the observer gallery, watching the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. She no longer needed to project an aura of mysterious authority or demonstrate impossible powers. The architects had completed their work and returned to whatever higher dimensions they called home, leaving behind only a friendly farewell note and a cookbook titled Comfort Foods Across the Cosmos that had already become a bestseller on 1,000 worlds. At the front of the assembly, Speaker Kaivan was managing the proceedings with a skill that surprised everyone, including himself. The former military commander had discovered that he had natural talents for parliamentary procedure and conflict resolution that had been buried under decades of military conditioning. The motion to convert all remaining weapons platforms into art galleries and cultural centers passes unanimously, he announced, his voice carrying none of the harsh military authority it once had. Instead, he sounded warm and genuinely excited about the positive changes happening across the galaxy. "Our next agenda item comes from the Crystalline Hive Collective," he continued, consulting notes written on handmade paper instead of military, tactical displays. "They're proposing a galaxy-wide mental health awareness campaign to help species that are still adjusting to their emotional awakening." The response from the assembly was immediate and enthusiastic. Beings who had once been mortal enemies were now working together to help each other heal from centuries of trauma and conditioning. But perhaps the most remarkable moment came when former Supreme Overlord Thargon slowly raised one of his tentacles to request permission to speak. The being who had once been known as the Terror of 14 Systems now wore simple robes decorated with peaceful symbols from various cultures. "My fellow beings," he began, his voice shaky with emotion, "I need to formally apologize to 17 different species that I attempted to completely exterminate during my time as Supreme Overlord." The entire assembly fell silent, not with fear, as they once would have, but with respectful attention. "I have spent the past months learning about each of these civilizations, their histories, their cultures, their dreams and hopes," Thargon continued. "And I have prepared individual haikus for each species, expressing both my deep remorse for my past actions and my sincere hopes for friendship in the future." What followed was perhaps the most moving poetry reading in galactic history. As Thargon recited each haiku, representatives from the affected species responded not with anger or demands for justice, but with forgiveness and invitations to learn more about each other's cultures. The assembly erupted in appreciative sounds, the chirping, humming, clicking, and singing that different species used to express joy and approval. It was like listening to a cosmic orchestra of happiness. Later, as the assembly was winding down and Admiral Boram was preparing to return to Earth, Commander Kyvan approached her with a carefully wrapped package. The former military commander now wore flowing robes embroidered with flowers from his homeworld, and his compound eyes had been trained to express warmth and kindness instead of cold calculation. "Admiral Boram," he said, offering her the package with both hands, "I wanted to thank you personally. You and your people could have destroyed us completely, but instead you helped us remember who we really were underneath all that anger and fear. You gave us back ourselves." Boram unwrapped the gift carefully and found a beautiful pottery bowl glazed in soft blues that reminded her of Earth's sky and oceans. The craftsmanship was clearly improving. Kyvan had been practicing his pottery skills diligently over the past months. "It's absolutely beautiful, Kyvan," she said sincerely. "I'll treasure it." "The architects chose their guardians wisely," Kyvan replied. "Humans could have used your advanced knowledge to dominate the galaxy, but instead you chose to help others find joy and peace. That says everything about your species' character." As Boram's shuttle departed the emotional support and began its journey back to Earth, she looked out the viewport at a galaxy that had been completely transformed. Former warships now served as mobile gardens, traveling from system to share agricultural knowledge and beautiful plants. Ships that had once carried instruments of destruction now housed schools, libraries, community centers, and art studios. The galaxy's most feared military force had become its most enthusiastic support network, with former soldiers eagerly volunteering to help with disaster relief, education programs, and cultural exchange initiatives. Just as Boram was settling in for the long journey home, her communication system chimed with an incoming message from the outer regions of the galaxy. "Admiral, we're receiving reports of a new species in Sector 7, her communications officer reported. "They're calling themselves the Inevitable Conquerors, and they claim that nothing in the universe can stop their advance toward galactic domination." Boram smiled, thinking about all the former military commanders who were now teaching pottery classes to reformed space pirates and organizing interspecies cooking competitions. "Standard protocol," she replied calmly. "Send them dinner invitations. And ask what kind of food they prefer. Also make sure our supply ships stock extra tissues. They're going to need them when the empathy wave reaches their fleet." As her shuttle continued toward Earth, Boram reflected on how the galaxy had settled into its new normal. Billions of beings who had spent their lives focused on conquest and domination were discovering that the greatest victory of all was learning to genuinely care for one another. Somewhere in dimensions beyond normal space and time, the architects watched their latest successful project with satisfaction. They added another thriving galactic garden to their cosmic collection and began preparing the seeds of possibility for the next galaxy that was ready to grow beyond fear and into love. The universe was becoming a more beautiful place, one civilization at a time.